The desolate expanse of the starship graveyard stretched endlessly before Cashin, a graveyard of forgotten dreams and obsolete ambitions. He moved methodically through the labyrinth of twisted metal and shattered hulls, his tools clinking faintly against his belt. This was where he thrived, amidst the remnants of civilizations that had reached too far and fallen too hard. For Cashin, the allure of unearthing something unique, something untouched by salvagers before him, was as intoxicating as it was dangerous. A glint of light caught his eye through the dusty haze, drawing him deeper into the ruins. His boots crunched over shards of composite alloys as he approached the source. Nestled within the crumbled framework of an ancient docking bay was a sealed containment pod. Its smooth, dark surface pulsed faintly, almost imperceptibly, with veins of amber light. Symbols etched along its edges glowed dimly, their alien script unlike anything Cashin had encountered before. His breath hitched. This was no ordinary relic. The pod seemed intact, untouched by the scavengers who had long since stripped this sector bare. Cashin crouched and ran his gloved fingers over the symbols, a mixture of reverence and curiosity filling him. Whatever lay inside was ancient and valuable, perhaps a piece of technology that could fetch enough credits to keep him solvent for years. But there was a weight to this discovery, a heaviness in the air that prickled the back of his neck. The console next to the pod sputtered weakly as Cashin connected his portable power supply. The amber light brightened, casting flickering shadows across the chamber. His heart raced as the console buzzed to life, its screen displaying incomprehensible data streams. With a practiced hand, he bypassed several damaged circuits, searching for an access command. As he worked, fragments of text resolved into a language his system could partially translate. Class Omega threat, do not release. Cashin frowned, tapping his fingers against the screen. Warnings like these were often remnants of paranoia from bygone eras, their threats exaggerated or misinterpreted by failing systems. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease worming its way into his thoughts. His gaze flicked to the pod. Whatever lay within had been entombed here for a reason, but reasons were often the enemy of profit. He had come too far to walk away now. The repair process took hours. Sweat beaded on his brow as he adjusted delicate connections and recalibrated ancient protocols. The containment pod began to hum, the amber veins now glowing steadily. For a moment he hesitated, his finger hovering over the final activation command. A strange noise, almost like a low growl, emanated from deep within the pod. Cashin's pulse quickened. Was it mechanical? Organic? The sound was unnerving in its ambiguity. He pressed the command. The pod's surface hissed as it split open, releasing a burst of pressurized air and a faint, acrid smell. Cashin stepped back, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol holstered at his side. Slowly, a massive figure emerged, shrouded in steam. His first impression was one of raw power, muscles rippling beneath a metallic frame. Fur and steel melded together in a seamless, unnatural harmony. Red eyes, glowing like embers, locked onto him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. The creature, a towering wolf-like form augmented with cybernetics, snarled, its teeth gleaming. Cashin's instincts screamed at him to flee, but his legs felt rooted to the ground. The creature's movements were both fluid and deliberate as it stepped from the pod, its claws clicking against the floor. "You are not one of them," the wolf said, its voice a low, guttural growl, resonating like a storm contained within a whisper. Cashin blinked, his mind racing to process the words. The wolf spoke his language, though its tone carried an accent unfamiliar to him, a blend of feral and precise. "One of who?" Cashin managed, his voice steadier than he felt. The wolf's gaze narrowed, its head tilting slightly as if weighing the response. "The ones who bound me," it said, its eyes briefly flicking to the shattered remnants of the pod. "Their stench lingers, but they are gone." Cashin lowered his pistol cautiously, but didn't let go of it entirely. "I don't know who you're talking about. I found you here, dormant. You've been trapped for a long time." The creature let out a sharp, barking laugh devoid of humor. Trapped, it repeated, the word dripping with disdain. Enslaved. Used. Cast aside. Its voice dropped into a snarl. Centuries of servitude, guarding treasures that were never mine, for masters who dared to call themselves gods. Cashin's unease deepened, but curiosity anchored him in place. "Who are you?" he asked. "What are you?" The wolf's gaze burned into him. "I am Fenrax, the wolf guardian," it said, the words carrying the weight of a name that had once inspired fear. Created as a weapon, betrayed as an afterthought. It took a step closer, and Cashin felt the temperature in the room seem to drop. "You are either a fool or a thief to have awakened me." Cashin held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I didn't mean any harm. I thought you might be valuable." "Valuable?" Fenrax interrupted, baring its teeth. "You value things you barely comprehend. Typical of your kind." The insult stung, but Cashin chose not to react. "Look," he said carefully, "if you're free now, maybe we can help each other. I know this place. I can get us out of here." Fenrax regarded him for a long moment, the silence stretching thin and taut. Finally, it nodded, though the motion was more calculated than trusting. "Very well," it said, "but know this, human. If you attempt to deceive me, you will regret it." The words were a promise, not a threat, and they sent a shiver down Cashin's spine. He nodded slowly, swallowing hard. "Understood." As they left the chamber, the containment pod hissed again, collapsing inward as though the act of freeing its prisoner had drained its last reserves. Cashin glanced over his shoulder, a gnawing sensation settling in his chest. He didn't know what he had just unleashed, but one thing was certain: his life, and perhaps much more, had just irrevocably changed. Steam lingered in the air like a phantom, curling around the chamber's jagged edges as Fenrax stretched, testing his freedom. His movements were both deliberate and unervingly fluid, each step a mixture of predatory grace and mechanical precision. Cashin stood motionless, every instinct urging him to run, yet he knew flight would be futile. The towering wolf-like figure before him wasn't just powerful. It radiated an ancient, almost primal authority that seemed to press against the air itself. Fenrax turned his glowing red eyes toward Cashin, studying him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "You're unarmed," Fenrax observed, his voice carrying the faintest trace of amusement, though his gaze lingered on the pistol holstered at Cashin's hip. "For a supposed liberator, you don't appear eager to trust the one you've freed." Cashin swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet the creature's gaze. "I'm not a liberator," he said carefully, choosing his words like a man navigating a minefield. "I didn't know what I was opening. I'm just a mechanic." Fenrax tilted his head, his massive ears twitching. "A mechanic," he echoed, his tone both curious and skeptical. "You awaken a prisoner without knowing their nature, and you expect me to believe you are mere tinkerers?" Cashin clenched his fists, suppressing the urge to snap back. "I was scavenging," he said evenly. "I thought I'd found a piece of salvage, something worth enough to keep me fed and flying for a while." His voice dropped, tinged with frustration. "I didn't expect you." Fenrax's laugh rumbled low in his chest, more growl than mirth. "Then your ignorance saved your life," he said. "Had you known, you might have tried to wield me, and that would not have ended well for you." The words hung in the air like a threat, but there was no malice in Fenrax's tone, only cold certainty. Cashin resisted the urge to step back, instead drawing a steadying breath. "You said you were enslaved," he said, steering the conversation away from his own precarious situation. "Who did this to you?" For the first time, Fenrax's confident demeanor wavered, his ears flattening slightly. "They called themselves the Elendari," he said, his voice quieter, almost contemplative. "An ancient race, masters of science and arrogance. They created me as a guardian, bound by circuits and chains to defend their secrets." Cashin frowned, trying to process the revelation. He'd heard whispers of the Elendari in the stories of travelers and historians, a species said to have vanished millennia ago, their empire crumbling under the weight of its hubris. But those were legends, fragments of a forgotten era. To hear Fenrax speak of them as if they were real made his chest tighten. They built you to protect something, Cashin ventured, his curiosity outweighing his fear. What was it? Fenrax's eyes narrowed, the glow within them intensifying. Their treasures, knowledge, technology, weapons of unimaginable power. But it was more than that. They sought to protect themselves from their own creations. For me, his claws flexed, scraping against the floor as he paced. I was the prototype, the apex of their experiments. And when they perfected their craft, they planned to erase me. The bitterness in his voice was palpable, a venom that had festered over centuries. Cashin felt a pang of sympathy despite himself. The image of this immense, formidable being trapped in servitude, discarded like obsolete machinery, was difficult to reconcile with the imposing figure before him. "So you've been here, dormant, all this time," Cashin said, his tone softer. "Not dormant," Fenrax corrected sharply. "Imprisoned. My mind was awake, my body paralyzed. I felt every passing second, heard the whispers of the centuries as they crawled by." He stopped pacing, fixing Cashin with a piercing look. "You cannot comprehend the depths of that isolation." Cashin shifted uncomfortably, the weight of Fenrax's words pressing down on him. "I didn't mean to bring you back to that," he said. "You didn't," Fenrax interrupted, his voice low but firm. "You broke the chains. Whatever your motives, you did what the Elendari could not. For that, I owe you a measure of restraint." Cashin raised an eyebrow. "Restraint?" Fenrax's lips curled into a toothy grin that was more predatory than reassuring. "I won't kill you." The words were delivered so matter-of-factly that Cashin couldn't help but let out a nervous laugh, though his pulse quickened. "Well, that's comforting," he muttered, his hand brushing the edge of his pistol. Fenrax's gaze followed the motion, and his grin faded. "Don't mistake my mercy for weakness, human," he warned. "I've endured enough betrayal to recognize it before it strikes." "I'm not planning anything," Cashin said quickly, holding up his hands. "If you want to leave, I'll help you. Just don't turn me into scrap." Fenrax's ears twitched, and he seemed to consider the offer. "Your fear is amusing," he said, though his tone lacked malice. "But you speak the truth. I can smell lies, and your scent tells me you value survival too much to risk deception." Cashin nodded cautiously, though the thought of being judged by his scent unsettled him. "So, what's the plan?" he asked. "You want out of here. What then?" Fenrax's red eyes glimmered as he turned toward the chamber's exit. "There is one thing that remains of the Elendari in this galaxy," he said. "A device capable of severing the last remnants of their control over me. Without it, I am still incomplete, still vulnerable." Cashin hesitated, the word echoing in his mind. Vulnerable. It was hard to imagine anything about Fenrax as incomplete or at risk. "And you know where this device is?" "I can sense it," Fenrax replied, his voice tinged with an edge of anticipation. "Its energy calls to me, faint but unmistakable." Cashin exhaled slowly, his mind racing through the possibilities. He could walk away, leave Fenrax to his quest, and avoid the risks that came with accompanying a cybernetic wolf on a mission of personal liberation. But a part of him, a stubborn, reckless part, wanted to see this through. The chance to uncover more about the Elendari, to witness technology and power beyond anything he'd ever dreamed of, was too tempting to ignore. "Fine," Cashin said at last, slinging his tools over his shoulder. "I'll help you find it, but you have to promise me something." Fenrax glanced at him, one ear flicking. "And what is that?" "No killing unless you absolutely have to," Cashin said, his voice firm despite the nervous energy buzzing beneath it. "If we're doing this, I'm not leaving a trail of bodies in our wake." Fenrax regarded him for a long moment before nodding once. "Agreed," he said. "But know this, human, if anything stands between me and my freedom, I will do what is necessary." Cashin didn't press further. He had a feeling that Fenrax's definition of necessary might be broader than his own. As they stepped into the dark corridors beyond, the faint hum of ancient machinery reverberated around them. Cashin couldn't shake the feeling that he had set something in motion far greater than he could control, but it was too late to turn back now. The corridors of the derelict station were eerily silent, the faint hum of forgotten machinery the only sound accompanying Cashin and Fenrax as they pressed forward. The air was thick with the smell of rust and decay, and shadows danced along the walls as their footsteps disturbed the thin layer of dust on the floor. Despite the oppressive stillness, Cashin's mind churned with questions he couldn't yet voice. Every glance at Fenrax reminded him of the fragile truce they'd struck, an alliance held together by necessity rather than trust. Fenrax moved with purpose, his claws clicking faintly against the metal flooring. His glowing red eyes scanned the corridor ahead, as though they could pierce through walls and decades of accumulated debris. Cashin followed a step behind, his hand hovering near his pistol, though he doubted it would do much good if things turned hostile. "You've been quiet," Fenrax remarked suddenly, his deep voice reverberating in the confined space. He didn't look back, but his ears swiveled toward Cashin, catching the faintest shifts in his breathing. "Just thinking," Cashin replied, his voice subdued. "Trying to figure out what I've gotten myself into." Fenrax let out a low, rumbling sound that could have been amusement. "You awakened something far older and more dangerous than you anticipated," he said. "But you also chose to stand by it. That speaks of either great courage or great stupidity. Maybe both," Cashin muttered under his breath. "I couldn't exactly leave you in that pod." Fenrax slowed, his head turning slightly. Many would have. Fear makes cowards of most creatures. There was no accusation in his tone, just a statement of fact. "Yet here you are, walking beside me." Cashin shrugged, though his grip tightened on his tools. "I've seen plenty of dangerous things in my time. Maybe not like you, but enough to know that running doesn't always save you." Fenrax gave a short nod, as if approving the sentiment. "Then perhaps you'll survive this longer than I expected." Before Cashin could reply, a faint tremor coursed through the floor, halting them both. Fenrax's ears perked, and his head whipped toward a darkened junction ahead. "We're not alone," he growled, his voice low and tense. Cashin froze, straining to hear what Fenrax had detected. At first, there was only silence, but then a faint, rhythmic clattering reached his ears. It grew louder, accompanied by a metallic scraping that sent shivers down his spine. His pulse quickened, and he instinctively drew his pistol, though the weight of it in his hand felt woefully inadequate. From the shadows emerged a cluster of mechanical forms, their spindly legs clicking against the floor as they advanced. Each one was a grotesque amalgamation of jagged metal and organic matter, their glowing blue optics scanning the corridor with a cold, predatory precision. Cashin recognized them immediately, sentinels, likely remnants of the Elendari's automated defenses. "They must have reactivated when I powered the pod," Cashin whispered, his throat dry. Fenrax didn't respond. His stance shifted, muscles tensing beneath his metallic fur as he positioned himself between the sentinels and Cashin. The creatures paused, their optics flickering as if assessing the threat before them. Then, in unison, they emitted a high-pitched whine and charged. Fenrax moved like lightning, a blur of feral strength and mechanical precision. His claws slashed through the first sentinel, tearing it apart in a shower of sparks and shredded metal. Another lunged at him, but he sidestepped with unnatural grace, its attack missing by inches before his jaws clamped down on its exposed core. The sound of crunching metal was followed by a burst of blue light as the sentinel collapsed. Cashin barely had time to react before one of the machines turned its attention to him. Its spindly legs clattered as it closed the distance, a jagged blade extending from its appendage. Swearing under his breath, Cashin fired his pistol. The shot glanced off the sentinel's armored shell, doing little more than slowing it down. He stumbled back, his heart racing as he tried to think of a way to disable it. "Hit the joints!" Fenrax barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. Cashin didn't have time to question the advice. Aiming carefully, he fired at the sentinel's nearest leg joint. The shot struck true, and the creature faltered, its movement becoming jerky and uncoordinated. Seizing the opportunity, Cashin swung his wrench with all his strength, smashing the Sentinel's optics. It collapsed in a heap, its limbs twitching erratically. The fight was over almost as quickly as it had begun. Fenrax stood amidst the wreckage, his metallic fur glistening with faint streaks of blue energy from the Sentinel's remains. His chest rose and fell in measured breaths, his glowing eyes scanning the corridor for any remaining threats. Cashin leaned against the wall, his hands trembling as he holstered his pistol. "Are there more of those things?" he asked, his voice unsteady. "Likely," Fenrax replied, his tone grim. "The Elendari were thorough in their paranoia. Their defenses will not rest until we are far from this place." Cashin exhaled sharply, his mind racing. "Then we'd better move. If more of those things show up, I'm not sure I'll be so lucky." Fenrax glanced at him, the faintest trace of approval in his expression. "You handled yourself better than I expected," he said. "But luck will not carry you far. If you wish to survive, you must adapt." Cashin nodded, though he wasn't sure what adapting meant when dealing with creatures like Fenrax or the Elendari's remnants. Still, he couldn't deny the thrill that coursed through him despite his fear. There was something exhilarating about being part of something larger than himself, even if it was dangerous and uncertain. As they continued down the corridor, Cashin couldn't shake the feeling that the Sentinels were only the beginning. Fenrax's mention of the Elendari's paranoia lingered in his mind, a stark reminder that whatever lay ahead would not be easy. But there was no turning back now. With every step, he felt the weight of his decision settling deeper into his bones. And somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of machinery grew louder, as if the station itself was waking up. The air grew heavier as Cashin and Fenrax ventured deeper into the ancient station. The faint hum that had followed them earlier now pulsed with a steady rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. Cashin couldn't tell if it was the station itself or his own anxiety that gave the sound a living quality. Every creak of the walls, every flicker of failing lights, set his nerves on edge. Fenrax, however, moved with unshakable confidence, his towering form leading the way through the labyrinth of corridors. "This place doesn't want us here," Cashin muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. His fingers gripped his pistol, though the thought of firing it again made his palms sweat. "It's like it's watching us." Fenrax didn't slow, his glowing red eyes fixed ahead. "The Elendari were masters of surveillance," he said. "Even in death, their creations remain vigilant. It is not paranoia, human. It is certainty." The words sent a chill down Cashin's spine. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting another wave of sentinels to emerge from the shadows. "So, how do we get past something that sees everything?" "We move quickly," Fenrax replied, his voice firm. "And we make no mistakes." Cashin resisted the urge to point out that he wasn't exactly a model of precision under pressure. Instead, he focused on keeping pace with Fenrax, whose movements were so fluid they seemed almost unnatural. Each step the wolf took was deliberate, calculated, as if he could sense every danger before it appeared. The corridor widened into a vast chamber, its walls lined with intricate carvings and glowing patterns that shifted and pulsed with a faint, otherworldly light. Cashin stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. The carvings depicted scenes of the Elendari's rise, cities that floated above the stars, ships that dwarfed planets, and machines that seemed to bend reality itself. It was awe-inspiring, but there was something unsettling about the images. The figures etched into the walls looked both majestic and alien, their expressions unreadable. Fenrax paused beside him, his gaze sweeping over the carvings. "This is their story," he said, his tone tinged with something almost like disdain. "Their hubris immortalized in stone. They believed themselves gods, and they paid the price." Cashin frowned, his eyes drawn to a particular carving near the chamber's center. It showed a massive, wolf-like figure surrounded by smaller shapes that looked like the sentinels they'd encountered earlier. Chains spiraled around its limbs, binding it to a jagged spire. "Is that you?" he asked, pointing. Fenrax's ears twitched, and his lips curled into a snarl. "It is their mockery," he growled, "a reminder of my enslavement. They etched it here, to celebrate their triumph over me, to warn others of what happens when power defies its creators. Cashin hesitated, unsure of what to say. The image of Fenrax, chained and defeated, didn't match the indomitable presence standing beside him. It was a reminder of how much the wolf had endured, and how dangerous he must have been to warrant such precautions. As if sensing Cashin's thoughts, Fenrax turned to him. "Do not pity me," he said sharply. "Their arrogance was their undoing, and their creations, no matter how clever, were not eternal." Cashin nodded, though he couldn't shake the unease that lingered as they moved deeper into the chamber. At its center stood a pedestal, its surface smooth and reflective like obsidian. Hovering above, it was a sphere of pulsating energy, its surface crackling with arcs of light that seemed to reach out like fingers. Fenrax stopped short, his body tensing. "That's it, isn't it?" Cashin asked, his voice low. "The thing you're looking for?" Fenrax nodded once, his eyes fixed on the sphere. "The resonance core," he said. "It contains the key to severing the last remnants of their control. But it is not unguarded." Cashin swallowed hard, his gaze darting around the chamber. "What kind of guard are we talking about?" Fenrax's ears twitched, and his claws flexed against the floor. "One designed to destroy anything that comes near." The Elendari called it the Sentinel Prime. As if summoned by the name, a deep, resonant hum filled the chamber. The carvings on the walls flared to life, their glow intensifying until the entire room was bathed in a blinding light. Cashin shielded his eyes, squinting to make out the shape that emerged from the far wall. The creature was colossal, its body a grotesque fusion of metal and organic tissue. Its four limbs were spiked and jointed at unnatural angles, and its head was an amorphous mass of shifting plates that glimmered like liquid mercury. Blue energy pulsed through its veins, and its movements were accompanied by a sound like grinding stone. "Stay behind me," Fenrax growled, his voice a low rumble. He stepped forward, his posture low and predatory, his claws gleaming in the ethereal light. Cashin didn't need to be told twice. He ducked behind a nearby column, peering out cautiously as the Sentinel Prime loomed over Fenrax. The creature seemed to assess its opponent, its liquid-like head tilting with a strange, almost curious motion. Then, with a deafening roar, it lunged. Fenrax met the attack head-on, his claws slashing through the air with terrifying speed. The two collided with a thunderous crash, the force of the impact shaking the chamber. Sparks and fragments of metal flew as Fenrax tore into the Sentinel Prime's armored limbs, but the creature was relentless. Its spiked appendages lashed out, forcing Fenrax to dodge and weave with unnatural agility. Cashin watched in awe and terror, his mind racing for a way to help. His eyes fell on the pedestal, and an idea began to form. If the resonance core was what the Sentinel Prime was protecting, then perhaps disrupting it could turn the tide. It was a gamble, but he didn't see any other options. Drawing a deep breath, Cashin sprinted toward the pedestal, keeping low to avoid drawing the Sentinel Prime's attention. Fenrax was still locked in combat, his movements a blur as he danced around the creature's attacks. Cashin reached the pedestal and hesitated, unsure how to interact with the core without being vaporized. "Hurry!" Fenrax's voice roared, his tone laced with urgency. Cashin gritted his teeth and reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of the sphere. The energy coursing through it sent a jolt up his arm, but he forced himself to hold on. The sphere pulsed, and a cascade of symbols lit up along its surface. It was like the station was speaking to him, though he couldn't understand the language. The Sentinel Prime suddenly froze, its head snapping toward the pedestal. Cashin's heart lurched as the creature began to advance on him, its massive limbs tearing through the chamber like scythes. Fenrax seized the opportunity, launching himself at the Sentinel Prime's exposed back. His claws tore into its core, sending a shower of sparks and fluid cascading to the floor. The Sentinel Prime let out a deafening wail, its body convulsing before collapsing in a heap of shattered metal. Cashin stumbled back from the pedestal, his chest heaving as the chamber fell into silence. Fenrax stood amidst the wreckage, his glowing eyes locking onto Cashin. "You took a risk," Fenrax said, his voice steady but sharp. "But it paid off." Cashin let out a shaky laugh, his legs trembling beneath him. "Yeah, well, I figured it was worth a shot." Fenrax nodded, his gaze shifting to the resonance core. "The way is clear," he said. "Now, the real work begins." The resonance core pulsed steadily now, its light dimmed but still alive. Cashin could feel its hum vibrating through the floor, a sensation that seemed to settle in his chest like a second heartbeat. He stood near the pedestal, still catching his breath from their encounter with the Sentinel Prime. Fenrax, meanwhile, prowled around the fallen Guardian, his claws scraping the metal floor as he inspected the remains. "What's next?" Cashin asked, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of composure. "I'm guessing that wasn't the grand finale." Fenrax snorted, a sharp exhalation that bordered on a laugh. "If only it were that simple," he said, straightening. His gaze fixed on the core, a flicker of something unreadable passing across his features. "The core is the first step, not the last. Activating, it will sever the remaining chains of the Elendari's control over this place, and over me." Cashin frowned, stepping closer. "And then what? We just walk out of here like none of this ever happened?" Fenrax's ears flicked back, his expression darkening. "The Elendari designed their prisons well. Releasing me will not go unnoticed. They built fail-safes upon fail-safes, each more insidious than the last. Once we proceed, there is no turning back." Cashin hesitated, the weight of Fenrax's words pressing down on him. The enormity of what they were doing finally began to sink in. He wasn't just helping a mysterious, wolf-like being escape captivity. He was dismantling the remnants of an ancient, oppressive civilization. The consequences of their actions rippled out before him, unpredictable and potentially catastrophic. "What happens if we fail?" he asked quietly. Fenrax turned to him, his crimson eyes glowing softly in the dim light. "Failure is not an option," he said, his tone resolute. "You've already set events in motion, human. The Elendari's legacy has rotted for centuries. It is time for it to end." The word struck something deep within Cashin. He nodded, his resolve hardening. "All right," he said. "What do I need to do?" Fenrax stepped toward the core, his massive frame casting long shadows across the chamber. "The core must be attuned," he explained. "It was designed to respond to Elendari frequencies, but their arrogance blinded them to the idea that others might learn their secrets. I can guide you, but you must be the one to complete the sequence." Cashin swallowed hard, his fingers flexing nervously. "Why me?" "The core will resist me," Fenrax said. "It sees me as a prisoner, an aberration. You, however, are an anomaly, an outsider. It may not trust you, but it will not reject you outright." Cashin wasn't sure if he found that explanation comforting or unsettling, but he nodded anyway. He stepped up to the pedestal, the hum of the core intensifying as he approached. Symbols flickered across its surface, shifting and rearranging in a language he couldn't understand. "What am I looking at?" he asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "Patterns," Fenrax replied, his tone calm but firm. "You must align them. Think of it as harmonizing a song. You'll know when the pieces fit together." Cashin stared at the swirling symbols, his mind racing. Harmonize a song? He wasn't even sure what key the thing was playing in. Still, he reached out hesitantly, his fingers brushing the core's surface. It responded instantly, the symbols flaring brightly before dimming again. He tried moving one of the glowing patterns, dragging it into place beside another. The core pulsed in response, the light flickering as if in approval. "You're doing it," Fenrax said, his voice steady. "Trust your instincts." Cashin gritted his teeth, his focus narrowing. He slid another symbol into place, then another, watching as the patterns began to coalesce into something cohesive. Each movement sent a wave of energy through the chamber, the hum growing louder with each correct alignment. But then the core shuddered, its light flaring red. Cashin flinched as a surge of energy jolted through his arm, leaving his hand numb. "What was that?" he demanded, stepping back. "The core is testing you," Fenrax said, his tone sharp. It seeks to measure your resolve. Do not falter. Cashin shook his hand, trying to dispel the tingling sensation. He glanced at Fenrax, whose gaze was unwavering. Taking a deep breath, Cashin stepped back to the pedestal. The symbols had scattered again, but this time they seemed more deliberate, their movements slower and more deliberate, as if the core itself was watching him. He reached out once more, this time with greater confidence. The symbols resisted at first, but as he worked, they began to yield, slotting into place with a satisfying hum. Sweat beaded on his forehead as the final pieces came together, the patterns forming a complex, interwoven design that pulsed with a soft, golden light. The core flared one last time, its energy spilling out in a wave that washed over the chamber. Cashin staggered back, his legs threatening to give out beneath him. Fenrax caught him, his clawed hand steadying Cashin's shoulder. "It is done," Fenrax said, his voice tinged with something that might have been relief or triumph. Cashin looked up at the core, now glowing with a steady, golden light. The oppressive weight that had filled the chamber seemed to lift, replaced by a strange, almost serene stillness. But the victory felt fragile, as if the station itself was holding its breath. "What now?" Cashin asked, his voice hoarse. Fenrax stepped toward the core, his eyes gleaming. "Now we leave this place," he said. "But do not think our journey is over. The Elendari's echoes will not fade quietly. Their creations, those that remain, will hunt us." Cashin nodded slowly, his chest tightening. "And you?" he asked. "What happens to you now that the core is activated?" Fenrax turned to him, his expression unreadable. "I am free, but freedom is not without cost. The chains that bound me are broken, but their remnants still linger. My purpose has been twisted for centuries. It will take time to untangle what remains." Cashin didn't know how to respond. The weight of what they'd accomplished, and what lay ahead, settled heavily on his shoulders. But one thing was certain, he couldn't stop now, not when they'd come this far. Fenrax's gaze softened, and he inclined his head slightly. "You've proven yourself, human," he said. "But the path forward will demand more than courage. It will demand everything." Cashin straightened, his resolve hardening. "Then I guess I'd better be ready." Fenrax gave a faint, approving nod. Together, they turned toward the chamber's exit, the golden light of the core casting long shadows behind them. The corridor outside the chamber was eerily quiet, its once vibrant pulse now muted as the effects of the resonance core's activation rippled through the station. Cashin walked beside Fenrax, the weight of their actions pressing down on him. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the station itself was trying to push them back, but Fenrax was relentless, his pace unyielding. Cashin couldn't help but glance at the towering figure of the wolf-like being beside him, his red eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Fenrax had been a prisoner for centuries, an existence he had endured through unimaginable torment. Now, freed from the Elendari's control, he was something both magnificent and terrifying. There was a rawness to him, a primal power that seemed to seep through every fiber of his being. And yet, for all that, Cashin sensed the sorrow behind the fierce gaze. "You never really told me much about what happened," Cashin said, breaking the silence. "About what the Elendari did to you." Fenrax's stride didn't falter. He remained focused on the dark expanse ahead, his voice steady when he spoke. "They took everything from me," he said quietly. "My will, my freedom, my purpose. I was bound by chains that no creature should ever wear. Their technology, their cruelty, it changed me, made me something less than I was." Cashin looked up at him, sensing the gravity of the words. Fenrax was a being of immense strength, but what had been done to him by the Elendari wasn't just physical. It had been psychological, emotional, a slow corrosion of his soul. "How did you survive it?" Cashin asked, his voice softer now, as if afraid the question might break something fragile. Fenrax's eyes flicked toward him, a faint glimmer of something like humor or bitterness in his gaze. "Survival was never the point. I existed to serve. It was only when the shackles began to weaken that I started to remember what it meant to be free." His expression darkened, and he looked away. But freedom is a dangerous thing when you've been broken for so long. I don't know who I am without them. Cashin considered the words for a moment, his mind spinning. He knew what it was like to be trapped, to feel cornered by forces beyond his control. He couldn't imagine centuries of servitude, of losing his very sense of self. It was more than he could comprehend. I don't know what comes next for you, Cashin said slowly, but we have to keep moving forward. The Elendari, they're not just going to let this go. Fenrax nodded, his jaw tightening. They never let anything go. The sound of distant footsteps echoed through the corridor, and both men instinctively tensed. The Elendari Sentinels, their mechanical creations, were still present, and if they hadn't already been alerted to their presence, they would be soon. Fenrax's senses were already sharp, every muscle primed for action. We'll need to move faster, Fenrax muttered, his hand resting on the hilt of a blade that had materialized in his grasp. It gleamed with a cold, sharp edge, its design ancient and deadly. Cashin's hand hovered near his pistol, his heart pounding. I don't know if I can keep up with you. Fenrax gave a short, gruff laugh. You'll learn. Without another word, the wolf surged ahead, moving like a shadow through the dim light, his senses attuned to every change in the atmosphere. Cashin followed more slowly, the weight of his pack pressing against his back, every step a reminder of the responsibility that had been thrust upon him. This mission, this rebellion against the Elendari, was no longer just about the prize at the end. It was about survival, about unraveling an empire that had enslaved so many, including the enigmatic being now at his side. The tension in the air thickened, and soon Cashin began to hear the mechanical clanking of the sentinels. They were close, too close. He exchanged a quick glance with Fenrax, who had already slipped into a crouch, his body coiled with lethal intent. You take the ones on the left, Fenrax whispered. I'll handle the others. Cashin's heart skipped a beat, his breath quickening. Right? Fenrax's eyes glinted with something that was almost amusement, or perhaps it was the thrill of combat. It was hard to tell, but before Cashin could process the thought, Fenrax darted forward, a blur of movement. His claws slashed through the air, and the first sentinel crumpled to the floor, its metallic body collapsing with a resounding crash. Cashin winced at the sound, but there was no time to dwell on it. He moved swiftly, positioning himself behind a nearby pillar to get a clear shot. The sentinels were formidable, massive, armored constructs with jagged edges and glowing eyes that scanned for any sign of weakness. But they were machines bound by logic and programming. Cashin could read their movements, anticipate their actions. He fired in quick succession, the shots ringing out with deadly precision. One sentinel fell, then another, the force of his shots disabling them before they had a chance to retaliate. But there were more, always more. Cashin ducked behind cover again, his pulse thundering in his ears. He caught sight of Fenrax, who was fighting with a fluidity that defied his size. Each strike was measured and devastating, a perfect blend of primal power and surgical efficiency. The sentinels didn't stand a chance. Still, Cashin couldn't shake the feeling that they were only delaying the inevitable. The Elendari's influence stretched far beyond this station, beyond even this galaxy. And though they had destroyed their sentinels and disrupted the core, it was clear that they were not finished. Not by a long shot. With the immediate threat dispatched, the two of them paused, taking stock of their surroundings. The corridor was littered with the remains of the sentinels, their mechanical bodies smoking in the wake of the battle. The faint hum of the station was quieter now, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Fenrax stepped forward, his eyes scanning the hallway ahead. We must reach the escape pods before they send more. Time is running out. Cashin nodded, his mind racing. He was no strategist, no soldier. But with Fenrax by his side, he felt a sliver of hope, a fleeting, fragile thing. They had come this far, but the war against the Elendari was just beginning. The path forward was uncertain, and the odds stacked high. But one thing was clear. They weren't going to stop until they tore down the empire the Elendari had built. Let's go, Cashin said, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. Fenrax gave him a sharp, approving glance. Stay close. Together, they pushed forward into the unknown, the sound of their footsteps echoing through the quiet halls as they raced toward whatever awaited them beyond the horizon of their mission.